Hi, Danny, Grace and Jude. This is the last section of the foundations before we move on to dynamic glucose management. It's all about how to measure success with diabetes. So the first thing to understand is what gets measured gets managed. If you are trying to measure everything with diabetes, you're going to burn out at a rate of knots. You only want to measure the most important things so they get managed. So the three things, in my opinion, that we need to keep a close eye on are the percentage of readings time in range between 4 and 10 millimoles per litre, 70 to 80 milligrams per decilitre, the HbA1c in either millimoles per mole or percentage, and then the total daily insulin dose in how many units for every kilo that we weigh. So we're going to work through each one of these, why they're important and what parameters we should be thinking about. Well, we've already discussed a lot about time in range, and there was a consensus statement recently in 2019 which suggested 70% or more of readings in time in range is where we want. We don't want any more than 4% lower than 3.9 or 4 millimoles per litre, and we don't want any more than 25% high. Now for me, 70% is going to be the absolute bare minimum of where we want to be for time in range. I'm currently 99% time in range, but that's because I've been practicing dynamic glucose management for 2 years and have built my skill level to quite a high level. For you, Grace and Jude will probably start at 70, 75 and try and build up 5% at a time, using exercise in between meals and setting a high alert at a reasonable level. And that's what GAME is of dynamic glucose management, so you'll be able to see that there. But obviously, as a young person, as young kids, you're not going to be achieving 99% time in range, but you certainly should be able to kind of get 70, 75, 80, 85 by 3 balanced meals, using exercise after eating, and basically understanding that you treat hypos or prevent hypos with fast-acting glucose. So all the skills that you've learned in the foundations that we build into a program of dynamic glucose management, you should be able to easily get 80% plus time in range. And when you're an adult like me, 90% is the minimum, 90-95% should be fairly easy as long as you practice the things that we've discussed. And the beauty about time in range is you can try some of these strategies and then review the results in 1 week time and get quick feedback about what's working and what's not. Whereas when we discuss HbA1c in a minute, the time frames are a little bit longer and it's not as easy to measure feedback. So the beauty about time in range is make a change, review what happens, and make incremental improvements by 5% or 2% on a weekly basis. HbA1c. So basically the HbA1c is measuring your red blood cells, the hemoglobin in your red blood cells, how much glucose is stuck to that. So the more glucose that's stuck to the red blood cells, the higher the HbA1c. This is an example of a HbA1c of 9%. This is a HbA1c of 6.5%. So you can see there's a lot less glucose. So when the HbA1c is measured, they take a blood sample, they spin it, and they measure how much glucose is stuck to your red blood cells. And the reason why that's important is there's a famous trial called the DCCT trial, which looked at and followed people for 7 years. And it looked at, depending on where their HbA1c is, over that sort of 7-year period, in 7 years' time, what was their risk of having retinopathy, eye problems, nephropathy, kidney problems, neuropathy, problems with sensations in your fingers and feet. And microalbuminuria is basically weeing out, or kidney issues, protein in the blood. So you can see all of these, what we call small vessel diseases, the risk of them increases as HbA1c goes up. And obviously for eyes, it can go really high once you start getting above 9%. So the suggestion is to try and get the HbA1c at 6.5% or 48 millimoles per mole and lower, is that's going to make sure your small vessels, your eyes, your kidneys, your hands are going to be protected in the long term. So that's why we look at HbA1c and aiming to keep it below 6.5% or 48 millimoles per mole. Something that's probably not taught that often, but is something that I believe is absolutely essential and vital to keep an eye on, is how much insulin you're on in terms of units for every kilo that you weigh. So very simply for me, I weigh about 100 kilos, I'm on about 35 units of insulin, so that's 0. So you do 35 divided by 100 gives you 0.35, that puts me at the very low cardiovascular risk. If I was on 120 to 125 units of insulin a day, that would be 125 divided by 100 would be 1.25, will put me at extremely high cardiovascular risk. So why is that going to be a problem? So we've already said people with type 1 diabetes have the issue of the insulin goes into the outer circulation and not into the portal vein. And having a very high circulating level of insulin in the blood increases your risk of storing fat and being fat, and also is a growth factor for cardiovascular issues. So we know that the higher the total insulin dose, or units per kilo, the higher the risk of cardiovascular disease. So obviously if at the moment you're 1 unit per kilo, you're not going to get all the way down to 0.2, but if you can move the next band down to 0.8 by reducing your insulin dose, by increasing your activity, 3 balanced meals, prioritizing exercising in between meals instead of correction doses, you can very quickly drop your total daily dose and drop your units per kilo. So something to keep an eye on. So is the lower the better? So is it better to have less than 0.2 units per kilo? It's very unlikely. The reason being is the type of people who have less than 0.2 units per kilo, who are people who do that much exercise that it's probably detrimental to their body. So multiple marathon runners, although they may be very fit, their long-term health outlook is not very good. So that might be a decision for them, which is the absolute right decision because they love running marathons. But in terms of long-term health, it's probably not great for them. People who are following a ketogenic diet, which is basically less than 25 grams of carbs per day, really high in fat and very little protein. Yes, you will manage your glucose levels very, very tightly. And for adults, it might be okay if it's done intermittently. But for children, it's a really, really bad idea because insulin is needed for growth. So if you have a very, very low insulin of sort of less than 0.2 units per kilo, the ability to grow, get strong, and develop both physically and mentally is going to be impaired by having insulin levels so low. And I guess what my position for you, Grace and Jude, now is there's no need to consider that, because using dynamic glucose management and using exercise to bring glucose levels down between meals negates the need to be so strict with carb intake, because you can use quick bursts of exercise to bring the glucose level down. You don't need to think about pushing, keeping the carbohydrate down to 25 grams. I've personally followed a ketogenic diet, and you can have a look at that in the 120-day carb experiment. And I followed that for sort of 3 months, had amazing glucose control. But for me personally, I didn't know it at the time, but I've got a cholesterol genetic issue, and that led to my cholesterol level going really high. And also, not to mention that socially it's very, very difficult. I play a reasonable level of cricket, and trying to perform in the cricket field with less than 25 grams of carbs a day in your system is... So yes, ketogenic diets and very low carb diets are amazing for tight glucose control. No question, no doubt. For adults, that might be okay. Jury's still out in terms of long-term health, but it might be okay. For children, certainly not. But I guess my position for you, Grace and Jude, and for me is, what's the point in going so extreme when you can use dynamic glucose management and short bursts of exercise between meals to achieve 90% plus time in range without the need for such carb restriction? Just doesn't make any sense in my opinion. So Grace and Jude, what we'll be aiming for you is a minimum of 80% or more time in range, a HbA1c of less than 48 millimoles per mole, or 6.5%, and certainly a total insulin dose of less than 0.6 units per kilo, which we'll achieve by regular amounts of activity in a day, at least 60 minutes, prioritizing the activity after eating, and using exercise in between meals to lower glucose instead of correction doses. Very easy to get that below 0.6 units per kilo. For me, because I've got a family history of heart disease, and I've got a genetic cholesterol issue, for me, 95% or more time in range, at least 75% time in range of the non-diabetic range of 3.3 to 6.7 millimoles per litre, a HbA1c of less than 40 or 5.7%, and a total daily insulin of less than 0.4, which I currently hit at the moment. When that creeps up to close to 0.4, it basically means I'm not doing enough activity, so I need to get my ass moving. At my absolute peak fitness, when I was cycling into work every day back and forward, that was down at 0.25 units per kilo, which is 25 units in a day for me. So there's some sort of perspective for you. So pulling that all together, only really need to measure 3 key things: time in range, HbA1c, and units per kilo. Try and keep obviously the time in range as high as possible, keep the HbA1c as low as possible, and keep the units per kilo as low as possible, but not lower than 0.2 units per kilo, because you're going to need that insulin for growth. So that's the foundation sections done. It's time now to move into dynamic glucose management and put everything that you've learned here into a system that's going to allow you to achieve that time in range, HbA1c and units per kilo. So I'll see you in dynamic glucose management.